So in this lecture, there were really 4 parts to it. One was a little bit of exploration as to why institutions, governance, and things like transaction cost and property rights are critical for looking at climate and environmental problems. And so what about institutions makes a difference, not just the quantity of it, but what about the quality? And so we sort of reviewed some of the background classics in the field. And then I presented 2 particular case studies, drawing on some recent work in India that focus on energy and forest kinds of problems. So in the first case study, we were looking at how the presence of a local NGO completely alters the provision and access and acquisition of clean cooking technologies. So it was a classic randomized controlled trial in some way, but what was unique about that was that the trial was stratified by one group that had the presence and experience of a non-governmental organization that had been active for many, many years, and the other group was observationally equivalent but did not have that kind of political capital, the institutional capital of the NGO. And the main result was that in the NGO communities, program was much more effective. There was something about those places that they were more open to new ideas, to elements of trust, which made that promotion package much more effective. And we were very clear in that setup of that study that one shouldn't expect that the same kind of positive effect of NGO is there everywhere. There could be certainly settings in which the NGO is rent-seeking and makes it more difficult, but at least we had found one case that was much more positive and good for environmental outcomes, because the NGO was playing this role of reducing uncertainty, reducing transactions cost, and promoting a good thing. Then we moved on to a second case study looking at the role of bureaucrats who are, again, not the central government or the central market actors, but they are a little bit closer to communities in the sense that we were looking at local bureaucrats who are in charge of managing forests. And the question we were asking is, if that local bureaucrat was from the community or from the home state compared to another one who was not from the home state, would that have an effect on the way they manage the forests? Of course, in much of this work, it takes years to compile the data sets to figure out the origin and the location and characteristics of those bureaucrats, and then overlay it with characteristics of the forest. And by and large, we find that when you look at forest cover in places where there was a home bureaucrat who was running the forest, there was actually some form of decline in the forest cover. So this idea that there are elites who capture the political process and use the forest for their own goods was somewhat clear in that setting. However, there was a little bit of an interaction effect in that if the home bureaucrat was from what is a scheduled tribe, someone who had a tribal origin, there they were much more protective of the forest, that there may have been something cultural about those communities. These results are, of course, extremely preliminary, but they are further evidence, like in the other case, that micro-institutions completely change the trajectory of some sort of a policy or a program. And so in the last part of the lecture, we did a bit of a reflection of where the literature is, and especially from this idea of institutions and organizations overlaying with environmental and climate sort of end goals. And we looked at some of the classics from all the way from Douglas North through Ostrom and Williamson and Avinash Dikshit, people who have come to this institute in the past and presented some of this work. So some of the main things I was reflecting on at the end was, without quite listing every single thing that these authors said, and they've said many things, is that institutions, whether we call them governance or rules of the game or transactions cost heavy processes, are absolutely vital. And that's partly because it's practically impossible to write a formal contract for many of the things in the environmental and climate space. For example, how much carbon sequestration can be achieved by forest, or how the water quality will improve, and how much and who can deliver those kinds of things in a contractual setting. Those become extremely difficult. And I think this is particularly peculiar for climate, environmental, and energy programs, projects, and policies. So my case studies illustrated that it's not just the quantity of the local institutions, but many aspects of its quality. For example, how long the NGO had been active and how many kinds of projects it was involved in seemed to change sort of whether the program was more effective or not. And when you have this kind of heterogeneity in preferences, it seems like micro-institutions or more sort of decentralized delivery of the problem is sort of the prominent way to do it. One of the messages was that it's not like markets and governments are not critical. Very much in the spirit of what Sam Bowles and Wendy Carlin have said, we should be thinking of civil society, these micro-institutions, as a complement to markets and governments, and not exactly a substitute, but playing a very big complementary role.